The sun-scorched wind carried whispers of Nora Valentine's arrival through Placitas, New Mexico territory, long before the stagecoach rolled to a dusty halt outside the Wayfarers' Inn. It was 1875, and the small mining settlement had seen its share of newcomers, but none quite like the raven-haired woman who descended from the coach with her chin held high despite the weight of judgment that seemed to follow her like a shadow. Isaac Sullivan watched from the wooden walkway of Hadley's General Store, his weathered Stetson pulled low over eyes that had seen enough of the world to know better than to judge a soul by the rumors that preceded them. His calloused fingers paused on the cigarette he'd been rolling, something about the woman's determined stride catching his attention in a way that made him forget the tobacco spilling onto his worn denim. "That's her," Elmer Hadley muttered beside him, the shopkeeper's voice thick with the self-righteousness that small towns seem to breed. "The Valentine widow. Heard she was run out of Santa Fe after her husband was found shot in their bed. Some say she did it herself." Isaac said nothing, merely observing as the woman collected her single trunk from the coach driver. He noted how the other passengers kept their distance, how the hotel clerk's smile faltered when she approached the counter. Even from across the street, Isaac could see the tension in her shoulders, the practiced way she pretended not to notice the stares. "Reckon she won't last a month here," Elmer continued. "Folks have long memories when it comes to scandal." "Folks have short minds when it comes to compassion," Isaac replied, finally lighting his cigarette and stepping off the walkway. Something pulled him toward the inn, though he couldn't have explained what it was if asked. Nora Valentine felt the stares burning into her back as she signed the hotel register. 2 years had passed since Michael's death, yet the whispers followed her from town to town like vultures circling a wounded creature. Placitas was meant to be her fresh start, far enough from Santa Fe that perhaps she could finally outrun her past. Yet somehow, the rumors always traveled faster than the stagecoach. "Room 7, top of the stairs," the clerk said, sliding a key across the counter with such care it seemed he feared their fingers might touch. "Thank you," she replied, her voice steady despite the familiar knot of humiliation tightening in her stomach. She'd grown accustomed to this reception, the sideways glances, the hushed conversations that stopped when she entered a room. She took the stairs with measured steps, willing herself not to rush, not to show weakness. The room was small but clean, with a narrow bed beneath a window that overlooked the main street. Nora set her trunk down and sat heavily on the bed, allowing herself a moment of vulnerability now that she was alone. She'd come to Placitas because of a letter from Mrs. Abigail Winters, the elderly owner of the town's only dress shop, who needed an experienced seamstress. It wasn't much, but it was honest work, and Nora's fingers were skilled with a needle. A knock at her door startled her from her thoughts. She quickly composed herself, smoothing her travel-worn skirt before opening the door a cautious crack. A tall man in a dusty duster stood before her, hat in hand. "Madam," he said, his voice deep but gentle. "Isaac Sullivan. I run the livery at the edge of town. Mrs. Winters asked me to check if you'd arrived safely." Nora studied him with wary eyes. Unlike the hotel clerk, his gaze met hers directly, without judgment or suspicion. "That's very kind, Mr. Sullivan. Please tell Mrs. Winters I'll call on her first thing tomorrow morning." Isaac nodded, a slight smile crossing his weathered face. "She's looking forward to it, and—" He hesitated, seeming to weigh his next words. "If you need anything while you get settled, my livery's just down the road, can't miss it." "I doubt I'll have need of horses," Nora replied, her guard still firmly in place. "We all need a friend in a new town," Isaac said simply, settling his hat back on his head. "Good evening, Miss Valentine." As his footsteps faded down the hallway, Nora closed the door and leaned against it, something unfamiliar stirring in her chest. Not hope she'd learned not to indulge in that particular luxury, but perhaps the faintest echo of it. Morning brought with it the realities of her situation. Nora made her way to Winter's dress shop, acutely aware of the conversations that ceased as she passed. the mothers who pulled their children closer. By the time she reached the small storefront with its display of modest gowns, her jaw ached from the effort of maintaining her composure. Abigail Winters was a tiny woman with silver hair and kind eyes that crinkled when she smiled. "There you are, my dear," she said, embracing Nora warmly. "I was beginning to worry the stagecoach had been delayed." The shop was a haven of fabrics, patterns, and the comforting smell of starch and cotton. As Abigail showed her around, introducing her to the work table and the various projects awaiting attention, Nora felt some of her tension ease. This was familiar territory. With needle and thread in hand, she could lose herself in the precision of stitches and the transformation of fabric into something beautiful. "You'll take lunch with me," Abigail insisted as midday approached. "I've made enough stew for both of us." They ate in the small kitchen behind the shop, and Nora found herself sharing more than she had intended about her apprenticeship with a French modiste in St. Louis, about her brief marriage to Michael, though she carefully avoided mentioning its end. "This town has a short memory for kindness but a long one for gossip," Abigail said suddenly, fixing Nora with a penetrating look. "Whatever brought you to Placitas, it doesn't matter to me. Your hands are skilled, and that's all I need to know." Tears pricked at Nora's eyes, but she blinked them away. "Thank you," she said simply. The bell above the shop door jingled, and Abigail rose to greet the customer. Nora heard a familiar deep voice and felt a strange flutter in her stomach. "Mr. Sullivan," Abigail called. "Come meet my new assistant properly. You two barely had a chance to introduce yourselves yesterday." Isaac ducked his head slightly as he entered the kitchen, as if the ceiling were too low for his tall frame. Up close, Nora could see that his eyes were a startling blue against his sun-darkened skin. He smiled, and the corners of his eyes crinkled in a way that suggested he did so often. "We've met briefly," he said, "though I don't believe I made much of an impression." "You made an impression," Nora replied, surprised at her own candor. "It's not every day a stranger offers friendship before knowing anything about me. Sometimes you can tell more about a person from how others treat them than from anything they might say," Isaac said, his gaze steady on hers. Abigail looked between them with obvious approval. "Isaac needs a new shirt," she announced. "That one's so patched it's more repair than original fabric. Nora, why don't you take his measurements while I see to those curtains Mrs. Peterson ordered?" Left alone with Isaac, Nora felt unaccountably nervous as she reached for her measuring tape. "If you could remove your coat," she said, her professional demeanor firmly in place. Isaac complied, standing patiently as she worked. His proximity was unsettling in a way Nora hadn't experienced in years, not since before Michael, when she was young enough to believe in possibilities. "You've caused quite a stir in town," Isaac said as she measured across his shoulders. Nora's hands stilled. "I'm accustomed to that." "I don't imagine that makes it any easier." She continued her work, carefully recording the measurements in a small notebook. "What have you heard?" she asked, unable to help herself. Isaac considered his answer carefully. "That you're running from something or someone. That trouble follows where you lead. And do you believe that, Mr. Sullivan?" "I believe that people are quick to condemn what they don't understand," he replied. "And I understand very little about you, Miss Valentine, except that you carry yourself with more dignity than most folks who have never known a day of judgment in their lives." Their eyes met, and for a moment, Nora felt seen in a way she hadn't in years, not as the scandal, not as the widow, but simply as herself. "That will be all," she said, stepping back and breaking the spell. "Your shirt will be ready in a week." Isaac nodded, reaching for his coat. "I look forward to it." Days settled into a rhythm in Placitas. Nora's mornings and afternoons were spent at the dress shop, her evenings alone in her small room at the Wayfarers Inn. Gradually, the stairs became less pointed, though she remained firmly on the periphery of town society. She told herself it was enough to have honest work, to no longer be running. Isaac Sullivan became a regular visitor to the dress shop, often with minor repairs that surely didn't require a professional's touch. Sometimes he brought small gifts, a bag of peppermint candies for Abigail, a book of poetry he thought Nora might enjoy. His attentions were careful, respectful, never presuming upon a familiarity she hadn't granted. One evening, as summer heat gave way to the first hints of autumn, Isaac appeared at the shop just as Nora was preparing to close up. Abigail had left early, her arthritis troubling her more than usual. "I thought you might allow me to walk you back to the inn," Isaac said, his hat in his hands. "The nights are getting cooler." Nora hesitated, aware of how it would look to be seen walking with him at dusk. "Thank you, but I wouldn't want to cause talk." "There's already talk," Isaac said with a shrug. "Might as well give them something worth talking about." A smile tugged at her lips despite herself. "You're not concerned about associating with someone of my reputation." "I've never much cared what people think of me," he replied, "and I'm more interested in who you are than who they say you are." They walked slowly through the town, the setting sun casting long shadows across the dusty street. Isaac told her about his journey west after the war, about the years he'd spent as a ranch hand before saving enough to open his own livery. "And what brought you to Placitas?" Nora asked. "Nothing dramatic," he admitted. "The previous livery owner wanted to retire and I had enough saved to buy him out. Seemed as good a place as any to put down roots." "And have you put down roots?" Isaac glanced at her, something warm in his eyes. "Getting there." They reached the inn too quickly. Nora paused on the porch, reluctant to end their conversation. "Thank you for walking with me." "My pleasure," Isaac replied. Perhaps you might join me for supper tomorrow. Abigail mentioned you haven't seen much of the town yet." Nora's immediate instinct was to decline, to retreat behind the walls she'd built so carefully. But something in Isaac's open expression made her reconsider. "Yes," she said before she could change her mind. "I'd like that." His smile was like sunrise. "I'll call for you at 6. As Isaac walked away, Nora became aware of Mrs. Prescott, the innkeeper's wife, watching from the doorway with undisguised disapproval. The familiar shame crept up Nora's neck, but she pushed it down, lifting her chin as she walked past the older woman without acknowledgement. Their supper at the small restaurant attached to the hotel was pleasant, despite the curious glances from other diners. Isaac proved to be a thoughtful conversationalist, drawing her out without pressing when she deflected questions about her past. He spoke of books they'd both read, of his dreams for expanding the livery, of the beauty of New Mexico territory that still caught him by surprise sometimes. "You're different than I expected," Nora admitted as they lingered over coffee. "Oh, and what did you expect?" She considered this, studying him across the table. "Someone less. Patient, perhaps. Most men I've known have wanted something from me." "And what do you think I want?" The directness of his question caught her off guard. "I don't know," she said honestly. Isaac's gaze was steady. "To know you, Nora, that's all." As autumn deepened, their suppers became a weekly occurrence. Nora found herself looking forward to Fridays with an anticipation that both thrilled and frightened her. She'd sworn after Michael's death never to give her heart again, not only because of the pain his betrayal had caused, but because of the vulnerability that came with caring. Yet Isaac Sullivan was slowly, patiently dismantling her defenses. He never pressed for details about her past, never treated her as anything but worthy of respect. When they walked together on Sundays, his hand sometimes brushed against hers, and the contact sent warmth spiraling through her that had nothing to do with the afternoon sun. November brought an early snow, and with it, the annual Founders' Day dance. Nora had no intention of attending until Abigail insisted she'd made a new gown specifically for Nora to wear. "I can't possibly," Nora protested, even as her fingers caressed the deep blue silk with its delicate pearl beading. "Nonsense," Abigail declared. "You've been hiding long enough. Besides, I happen to know a certain livery owner who's been asking if you'll be there." The night of the dance, Nora stood before the small mirror in her room, hardly recognizing the woman reflected back at her. The gown emphasized the slenderness of her waist, the blue a striking contrast against her dark hair, which she'd arranged in soft waves around her face. For the first time in years, she allowed herself to feel beautiful. The town hall was transformed with lanterns and pine boughs, a fiddler and banjo player providing lively music. Nora hesitated at the entrance, acutely aware of the conversations that faltered as she appeared. Then Isaac was there, handsome in a new suit, his eyes lighting up at the sight of her. "You look beautiful," he said, offering his arm. "So do you," she replied, then laughed at her mistake. "Handsome, I mean. I'll take beautiful," he grinned, leading her into the hall. They danced, Isaac's hand warm at her waist, his steps surprisingly graceful for a man who spent his days among horses. Nora was conscious of the stares, the whispers, but found that with Isaac's steady presence beside her, they mattered less. During a break in the music, Isaac led her outside for some air. The night was cold but clear, stars brilliant in the black sky above them. "Thank you for coming tonight," Isaac said, his breath forming small clouds in the frosty air. "I'm glad I did," Nora admitted. "Though I'm not sure everyone shares that sentiment." Isaac frowned, following her gaze to where several townspeople stood watching them through the window. "Does it still bother you, what they think?" Nora considered this, pulling her shawl tighter around her shoulders. "Less than it used to." "But yes, it still hurts to be judged for something they don't understand." "Will you tell me?" Isaac asked gently. "What happened in Santa Fe?" The question hung between them, and for a moment Nora considered deflecting as she always had. But something in Isaac's steady gaze gave her courage. "My husband was killed," she said quietly, "in our bed while I was sleeping beside him." Isaac's expression remained unchanged, no shock or horror crossing his features. "Go on." "I woke to the sound of the gunshot. There was so much blood." Nora shuddered at the memory. "The sheriff believed me at first when I said someone had broken in. But then they found letters. Michael had been embezzling from his employer, using the money to keep a second household, another woman, another life I knew nothing about. And they thought you killed him when you found out," Isaac surmised. Nora nodded, tears stinging her eyes. "They couldn't prove it, but the suggestion was enough. His employers wanted someone to blame, and I was convenient. The other woman vanished probably with whatever money Michael had hidden away. I was left with his debts, his shame, and a reputation I couldn't escape." She looked up at Isaac, bracing herself for the doubt she'd seen in so many eyes before. "I didn't kill him. But sometimes I think it would have been easier if I had, at least then, the judgment would be deserved." Isaac reached out slowly, as if giving her time to pull away, and brushed a tear from her cheek. "I believe you." 3 simple words, yet they crashed through Nora like a wave, washing away years of defensive walls. "Why?" she whispered. "Because I know you," Isaac said simply. "Because I've watched how you flinch when the blacksmith fires up his forge. The sound reminds you of that gunshot, doesn't it? Because I see how you hold yourself apart from everyone, not out of guilt but out of a fear of being hurt again." Nora hadn't realized how desperately she'd needed someone to believe her until that moment. She swayed slightly, and Isaac's arms came around her, strong and steady. "They'll never forget," she said against his chest, her voice breaking. "Wherever I go, they'll never forget my shame." Isaac drew back just enough to look into her eyes, his hands gentle on her shoulders. "Then I'll outlove their memory," he vowed softly. "I'll love you so well and for so long that one day, when people speak of Nora Valentine, they'll talk about the woman who made the finest dresses in the territory, who raised the most beautiful garden, who was loved so completely by a simple horseman that the old stories faded into nothing but dust." Nora stared up at him, stunned by the declaration. "Isaac, you can't know that. You can't know me well enough to make such a promise." "I know enough," he said. "I know that you're brave and kind and stronger than anyone gives you credit for. I know that when you smile, really smile, not the polite one you give customers, your whole face lights up. I know that I've been falling in love with you since the day you arrived in Placitas, and I'm tired of pretending otherwise." Before she could respond, the doors to the hall opened, and other couples spilled out into the night, laughing and talking. The moment was broken, but Isaac's words remained, echoing in Nora's mind as they returned to the dance. Later that night, as Isaac walked her back to the inn, they stopped beneath the old oak that stood in the town square. "I meant what I said," Isaac told her, his face serious in the moonlight. "I'm in love with you, Nora Valentine. I don't expect you to return those feelings yet. I know you've been hurt and trust doesn't come easily, but I'm a patient man and I believe some things are worth waiting for." Nora looked up at him, this man who had offered friendship when others offered only judgment, who believed in her innocence without question, who saw her truly saw her. "I'm afraid," she admitted, "I know. Not of you," she clarified, "of myself, of wanting something and then losing it again." Isaac took her hand, his thumb tracing gentle circles on her palm. "That's the risk of living," he said softly. "But isn't it better to take that chance than to spend your life hiding?" Nora couldn't find the words to express the conflict within her, so instead, she stood on tiptoe and pressed a gentle kiss to his cheek. "Good night, Isaac." His smile was understanding. "Good night, Nora." December brought heavy snows that blanketed Placitas in white, transforming the dusty mining town into something out of a fairy tale. Business at the dress shop slowed as travel became difficult, giving Nora more time to think about Isaac's declaration and her own confused feelings. She found herself watching for him from the shop window, her heart quickening whenever he passed. They still shared supper once a week, still walked together on Sundays, but something had shifted between them. A possibility hung in the air, unacknowledged but undeniable. Christmas approached, and with it came an invitation from Isaac to join him for dinner at his home, a small but well-built cabin behind the livery. "Nothing fancy," he assured her, "but I make a decent roast and I thought it might be nice not to be alone for the holiday." Nora accepted, ignoring Mrs. Prescott's raised eyebrows when she mentioned she'd be out for the evening. Over the months, she'd grown more immune to the town's judgment, focusing instead on the growing circle of people who had come to accept her: Abigail, the banker's wife who regularly commissioned dresses, the schoolteacher who shared her love of books. Isaac's cabin was warm and inviting, decorated with pine boughs and red berries. A small tree stood in the corner, adorned with paper stars and carved wooden ornaments. "Did you make these?" Nora asked, touching one of the delicate wooden horses. "Winter nights are long," Isaac said with a modest shrug. "Keeps my hands busy." Dinner was simple but delicious: roast beef, potatoes, and fresh bread that Isaac admitted he'd traded for at the bakery. They talked easily, laughing over town gossip and sharing stories of Christmases past. After they'd eaten, Isaac presented her with a small package wrapped in brown paper and tied with string. "It's nothing much," he said, suddenly seeming nervous. Inside was a wooden music box intricately carved with roses and vines. When Nora opened it, a sweet melody played, and nestled in the velvet lining was a silver locket. "Isaac," she breathed, touching the beautiful gift with reverent fingers. "You made this," he nodded, watching her face carefully. "Open the locket." Inside was a tiny pressed flower, a desert mariposa lily, delicate and perfect. "It was blooming the day you arrived," Isaac explained. "I saw it on my way into town that morning and thought it was strange to see one so late in the season. Then I saw you step down from that stagecoach and somehow it made sense." Tears filled Nora's eyes. No one had given her such a thoughtful gift in years, perhaps ever. "I don't know what to say." "You don't have to say anything," Isaac assured her. "I just wanted you to have something beautiful, something that's yours alone." Nora closed her hand around the locket, feeling its weight not just of silver but of meaning, of possibility. "I've been thinking about what you said at the dance," she said softly, "about outliving their memory." Isaac waited, his eyes never leaving her face. "I've spent so long defining myself by what happened in Santa Fe, by what people believe about me. I've been running for 2 years and I'm tired, Isaac, so tired of being afraid." She moved closer to him on the small sofa, close enough that she could feel the warmth of him. "You've shown me there might be another way to live, that maybe I don't have to keep running." Isaac's hand found hers, his fingers intertwining with her own. "You don't," he said simply. "Not anymore." "I can't promise I won't be scared," Nora whispered. "That I won't sometimes believe the worst about myself, about what I deserve." "Then I'll remind you," Isaac promised. "Every day, if that's what it takes." His free hand came up to cup her cheek, and Nora leaned into his touch, allowing herself to accept the comfort, the tenderness he offered. When his lips met hers, it was like coming home to a place she hadn't known existed, gentle but sure. A promise rather than a demand. The winter passed in a blur of quiet evenings by the fire in Isaac's cabin, of stolen kisses between shelves at the dress shop when Abigail was busy with customers, of slowly learning to trust not just Isaac but herself. By the time spring brought new growth to the desert, Nora had moved her few belongings from the inn to Isaac's cabin, ignoring the scandalized whispers of those who thought it improper. "Let them talk," Isaac said when she worried about his reputation. "They'll have nothing to say after the wedding." They were married on a perfect May morning, with Abigail beaming in the front row and half the town in attendance, some out of genuine goodwill, others out of curiosity. Nora wore a gown of ivory silk she'd made herself, with tiny pearls sewn into the bodice that caught the light when she moved. "You are so beautiful," Isaac whispered as they stood before the preacher, and Nora knew he meant more than her appearance. As summer approached, Nora found herself contemplating the future in a way she hadn't dared for years. She and Abigail discussed expanding the dress shop, perhaps adding millinery work. Isaac's livery was thriving, and he'd begun breeding horses as well as boarding them. One evening, as they sat on the porch of their cabin watching the sunset paint the distant mountains gold and purple, Nora turned to her husband with a smile that held both nervousness and joy. "Isaac," she said, taking his hand and placing it gently on her stomach, "I have something to tell you." His eyes widened in understanding, then filled with a wonder that made Nora's heart swell. "Really?" he whispered, as if afraid to believe it. She nodded, laughing as he pulled her into his arms, his joy as unrestrained as a child's. "A baby," he kept saying, shaking his head in amazement. "Our baby." News of Nora's pregnancy spread through Placitas like wildfire. To her surprise, it brought a shift in how the town regarded her. Women who had once crossed the street to avoid her now stopped to offer congratulations or advice. Perhaps, Nora thought, there was something about new life that made people willing to let go of old judgments. On a warm October afternoon, as golden leaves drifted from the cottonwoods along the creek, Isaac Sullivan paced outside their bedroom door while Abigail and the town's midwife attended to Nora. When at last he was called in, the sight that greeted him brought him to his knees beside the bed. Nora, exhausted but radiant, held a small bundle wrapped in the blanket she'd spent months embroidering with tiny horses and stars. "Come meet your son," she said, her voice thick with emotion. Isaac approached with reverence, gazing down at the perfect tiny face with its shock of dark hair. "He's beautiful," he whispered, gently touching the baby's cheek, "just like his mother." They named him Thomas after Isaac's father. He grew quickly, a happy child with his mother's dark hair and his father's blue eyes. By his first birthday, he was toddling around the dress shop, charming customers with his cheerful babbling. 3 years after Thomas's birth, a daughter joined their family, Grace, with her father's curls and her mother's determined spirit. Nora found herself busier than she'd ever been, balancing motherhood with her work at the shop, which she now co-owned with Abigail. The old whispers about her past occasionally resurfaced, especially when newcomers arrived in town, but they held no power over her anymore. For every person who repeated the old stories, there were 3 who defended her, who spoke of her kindness, her skill with a needle, her devotion to her family. On the 10th anniversary of their marriage, Isaac surprised Nora with a picnic by the creek where they'd often walked during their courtship. The children raced ahead, Thomas now a lanky boy of 9, Grace a spirited 6-year-old with perpetually skinned knees. "Are you happy?" Isaac asked as they spread a blanket beneath a cottonwood tree, watching their children splash in the shallow water. Nora looked at him, this man who had kept his promise to outlove the memory of her shame, who had given her not just a family but a sense of belonging she'd never thought to find again. Completely, she said, and knew it for the truth. The past would always be part of her story, but it no longer defined her. She was Nora Sullivan, now wife, mother, respected businesswoman. The whispers that had once followed her had faded to nothing, replaced by the laughter of her children, the love of her husband, the genuine friendships she'd formed over the years. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the grass, Isaac pulled her into his arms. "I told you," he said, his eyes crinkling with the smile that still made her heart skip. "I told you I'd outlove their memory." Nora leaned up to kiss him, this man who had seen her worth when she couldn't see it herself. "You did more than that," she said softly. "You taught me to outlove it too." And as their children's laughter echoed across the creek, as the first stars appeared in the deepening blue of the evening sky, Nora knew that some promises were indeed kept not just for a moment or a season, but for a lifetime.